when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, our west coast became a potential combat zone. Living in that zone were more than 100,000 persons of Japanese ancestry, 2/3 of them American citizens, 1/3 aliens. We knew that some among them were potentially dangerous. Most were loyal, but no one knew what would happen among this concentrated population if Japanese forces should try to invade our shores. This picture tells how the mass migration was accomplished. Japanese fishermen had every opportunity to watch the movement of our ships. Japanese farmers were living close to vital aircraft plants. So as a first step, all Japanese were required to move from critical areas such as these. But of course, this limited evacuation was a solution to only part of the problem. The larger problem, the uncertainty of what would happen among these people in case of a Japanese invasion, still remained. That is why the commanding general of the Western Defense Command determined that all Japanese within the coastal area should move inland. Immediately, the Army began mapping evacuation areas and for a time encouraged the Japanese to leave voluntarily. But trouble for the voluntary evacuees soon threatened in their new location. All persons of Japanese descent were required to register. They gathered in their own churches and schools, and the Japanese themselves cheerfully handled the enormous paperwork involved in the migration. The evacuees cooperated wholeheartedly. The many loyal among them felt that this was a sacrifice they could make in behalf of America's war effort. The Army provided housing and plenty of healthful, nourishing food for all. The residents of the new community set about developing a way of life as nearly normal as possible. They held church services, Protestant, Catholic, and Buddhist. They issued their own newspaper, organized nursery schools, and some made camouflage nets for the United States Army.
Headline personalities. And I, Yamamoto, will dictate peace terms in the White House. General Hama demonstrates coolness and calmness of a Japanese officer during air raid.
As we saw in the cartoon Tokio Jokio and the U.S. government's Japanese relocation propaganda films are two examples of popular media which help to foster a popular anti-Japanese sentiment among Americans. The cartoon relies on racist tropes and depictions of Japanese people to present the Japanese as a homogeneously barbaric race. This helped to encourage people to support the war with Japan, as well as to instill fear in the population in order to justify the incarceration of innocent Japanese Americans. There were two main approaches to the propaganda at the time, either explicitly racist sentiments which painted Japanese Americans as aggressive, ignorant, unassimilable savages, or it sought to justify the incarceration through fear tactics.
Japanese Relocation is a propaganda film that serves as a classic manipulation through the use of pathos, the optimistic music, the trustworthy white male narrator painting internment as a necessity toward the defense of a nation in grave danger. It was the American government's way of justifying their position, their decision to relocate and embitter the lives of Japanese Americans. Milton Eisenhower, the narrator of the film, asserts that the western interior of the United States had potential to become a combat zone, and the nation was weary of what actions Americans of Japanese ancestry could take had Japanese forces chosen to wreak havoc and harm. The narrator speaks in a serious tone and addresses what the government saw as the major problems with the Japanese Americans. They were heavily populated in the western coast, and they were thought of as a dangerous and untrustworthy race, indicating suspicion of espionage and sabotage. The military also saw a threat in their residence near the aircraft plants and coastal fleets, and therefore determined that all citizens of Japanese ancestry be moved inland in a controlled environment. The narrator goes on to suggest that most of the Japanese American residents willingly abandoned their properties and relocated out of loyalty, which is an idea quite disagreed upon by the actual victims of internment, based on testimonies. The impression this film gave to Americans was that any affiliation with Japanese ancestry deemed a person as volatile as the real Japanese enemy. The U.S. government needed to play on the grief of the American people and intensify them in order to get them on board with their racist legislations.